Good morning there, sir.
We're recording it to the cloud, and I'd like to introduce Jonathan Van Valin. He had a prolonged dying experience in which he experienced God's unconditional love, and after following this, he developed a healing ability, and I want to hear all about it. So go ahead, Jonathan.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. And we'll just dive in and get to the questions as they come up, as you like. So, the incident we're talking about for me took place, it was quite a while ago now. I was a young man, I was 29 years old. This is the result of a surgical procedure. I had an unusually severe case of sleep apnea, which was just a result of genetic quirks. And I'd had a surgery for that sleep apnea. I was in the hospital for 4 days. And on that fifth day, they somewhat unceremoniously booted me out of the hospital into the care of my father, who was inclined to watch over me in my recovery from that point. And my father took me out to the family farmhouse to watch over me. And there was very little he could do other than, I was more or less propped up in whatever room of my choosing, staring out windows, and that was about it. So I mentioned the sleep apnea and the surgery in part because it's a surgery that's rarely ever done these days. One of the reasons is that it's extremely painful in recovery.
Jonathan?
Yes.
I need you to speak more slowly and more distinctly so that we can understand you better.
All right. All right. All right. I'll slow it down a little bit. So the situation is I am recovering from this surgical procedure in the care of my father out at the family farmhouse. I was in the hospital for 4 days. I'm now in my father's care, even though there's almost nothing he can do really other than just watch over me, which is what he does. I am propped up staring out windows, and he kind of wanders into the room periodically throughout the day and has a look at me, and that's about all he can really do. So the surgical procedure was to remove all this tissue from the back of my throat, tonsils, adenoidal tissues. They removed a few chips of bone from the skull behind my nose, things like these. These were all efforts to make these airway passages larger so that the sleep apnea would be solved. Sleep apnea being this interruption in breathing when you sleep. And the reason this particular kind of recovery is very painful, which you'll understand why I'm bringing that up in a few minutes, but the analogy that was given to me at the time was I was going to have to know what it was like to break my femur and then have to walk on it for days. And that is because when they remove all this tissue in this very nerve-rich part of your body, you have to continue to use it to breathe and to swallow and things like that. And so very painful recovery. And I willingly took that on, but it was like many things that one takes on without really fully understanding the ramifications of it. This was truly a, mind-bending blackout level of pain. And the reason that was important was that after a couple of days in my father's care, and I want to say it was probably on day 3 or 4, what I experienced was what I can only describe as a simple inner click. And in the moment of that click, it was immediately clear that the animating life force here was beginning to drain away. And I was, in fact, beginning to lose that life force. My body was beginning to die. And in the same moment of that recognition, that click, that awareness, there were 3 awarenesses that arose. They sort of flooded in simultaneously, but I can only tell them sequentially. The first of them was simply that in the moment of that click and recognizing that my body was beginning to die, there was this clear recognition that I was not my body. And that was presented simply in the manner that, or in the way that uh, I could see that while the body was was beginning to die, that life force was draining away from it, whatever this aware consciousness was that recognized the body was beginning to die had itself not changed at all. It was not impugned, it was not impacted, it was not itself dying. It wasn't losing any life force in any way. And it was in that way that I could see that there was this difference. My body is beginning to die, and yet I, whatever that is, am not. And that afforded a level of freedom in that moment in a way that was so mind blowing, because what it meant that was that the pain in that body need not be mine either. If I wasn't the body, then the pain in that body just didn't really matter that much. And so it was in that this first moment of awareness of this that the suffering of this situation had been, it really had been as close as I could imagine to being absolute hell. And it had been that way for days. But in the moment of recognizing that I wasn't my body, there was a complete release from the suffering. And I want to be a little bit subtle about that, because it didn't mean that the pain in that body subsided. It did not. It was as present and full as ever. It's just that I understood immediately, completely, and this was not an intellectual understanding so much as it was a full, experiential awareness. Again, that the pain in that body need not be owned. I need not be, um, well, I learned the difference between pain and suffering, because the body was in pain, but I was not suffering it at all. And that affords an extraordinary kind of freedom, especially when one has been contending with that pain in the way that I had been. The second recognition that flooded in that same moment was that this process was happening rather slowly. It was like seeing the mercury drop in a thermometer. I could, perceive that life force draining away, but it was clearly draining at a rate that was going to take some time. And I didn't know how long in that moment, but it appeared to be that it was going to be at least a few days. And that awareness was met with delight, actually. And it was delight because the freedom of the revelation that I just described, being completely free of the suffering, was was such a revelation that when faced with the notion that this would take a little time, my response was not, oh my gosh, I'm dying, I only have a couple of days to figure this out. It was, wow, I have some time to revel in this, to marinate in it, to soak in it. And that came as a blessing. The third awareness that arose in this moment, and again, these all happen sort of simultaneously, really kind of blows away both of those previous recognitions to me. And they did so at that time. And I have to go back to the first of them, that I was not my body. Uh, in that first recognition, there was still the sense that although I was not my body, this was a non-corporeal sense of being, not contained by a body. It was still experienced in that moment as being a separate self. Like I may not have that corporeal form, but there's still this sense of separate identity and in it. But in this third recognition, it was clear that that too was collapsing. and that rather than being a separate self, an individuated but non-corporeal self, that that separation um, it simply wasn't true, and that that sense of personal identity was beginning to dissolve, disappear, dissipate, and to it's where words begin to fail, frankly, but that that individuated, separate sense of self was merging into what was absolutely overwhelmingly all, uh, dissipate into what was all-encompassingly vast, and that conferred a level of freedom that was so much greater even than that first revelation in which there was a release from any suffering, that one, it's very difficult to put into words, even though we're going to try today anyways. But what I would hasten to want to share about it more than anything is that it could not possibly confer any sense of loss. And the reason for that is that if one is merging into what is absolutely all-encompassingly whole and vast and all, well, what is whole and what is all contains everything, absolutely everything. And so there could not be any sense of loss in any way. In fact, if something is all-encompassingly whole and missing absolutely nothing, then there cannot be any sense of lack or want or need in any way. And that is precisely how it was experienced. And if there is no lack or want or need in any way, one of the most beautiful aspects of that is that there cannot be any fear. How could there be if there was no lack or want or need in any way? And as many of you have, I'm quite sure, come across the idea that the opposite of love is fear. And if there could not be any fear, then the sort of natural default setting then was something deeply loving and experienced most of all as a very all-encompassing peace. And
May
so,
I ask a question while you're at this
sure,
point?
sure.
When you merged with universal, all that is, did you have a sense of universal consciousness? Did your mind expand so that you had the answer to any question about your life or anything else?
Um, well, it's an interesting question, Dick, and it was not as though I experienced as being access to all the answers I could ever want. And perhaps that will make sense now because there was no sense of want. And so it was not as though all of a sudden I had answers available to me that I could go pick and choose. It was simply that there was no meaning or need for a question of any kind in the first place.
Okay, that's great. That's a good answer. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, there's kind of a corollary that comes up sometimes. People have often asked, especially when I describe that first state of being in which there's, you know, I recognize I'm not my body, even though there is still something of an individuated sense of self. And then that sort of expands to this all-encompassing allness. I've been asked, so was it an out-of-body experience? And I want to be a bit subtle about that. And because most of the time we speak about out of body experiences, which I did eventually later. I went on to have some of those kinds of experiences that, in a way that is very pretty common, I think, actually, um, in which there's this experience where someone has um, essentially is separated from their physical body. And we often hear these kinds of reports and just in these kinds of stories in which someone was floating over their body or looking down from the ceiling or somewhere else and, looking at the activity in the room and watching doctors operate on them or, traveling outside their body in other ways and things like that. And there's a way in which those kinds of experiences tend to afford us a sort of equal reality too. There's this physical body as a real thing here. There's this aware consciousness that is outside of that body and able to observe that body, and that these are separate things that have their own sort of separate reality and can observe each other. And the experience I'm describing in my own case is not that. So the the best way for me to try to explain it there is that uh, in that sense of overwhelming, all-encompassing allness, um, it's it was it the recognition of that was that this body had an essentially an illusory quality to it, that that non-corporeal overarching wholeness and allness was was so real or so much more real. It's very difficult to put words around it really, but it rendered the physical form to have this illusory quality to it, in which it was recognized then that as an illusion in the first place, an illusion is itself not real. It is a figment. And if something has no reality, it has no real being, it cannot really contain anything. It is itself a figment. And so it is not that there was a feeling or an experience that that very real body had another component, a soul that was outside of it and viewing that body. It was that the body itself had that illusory quality to it and had, as an illusion, had no capacity to have ever contained that aware being in the first place. How can an illusion have any real containment? It is itself an illusion. It's not real. It can contain nothing. And so it wasn't as though this was that sort of traditional out of body experience in that way. It was, again, that aware consciousness had never been contained in that body, would never be contained in that body. It appears to be such for a little seeming period of time, but that is an illusion and doesn't have real reality, and therefore it never really was never really a real construct. And it's among the reasons that being outside or that the dissolution of that body could seem utterly meaningless, not important. If an illusion is not real, it has no real reality, then if it appears or not, it's of no difference in value. So one way of sort of summarizing how this entire experience just destroyed any way of understanding my world in the ordinary ways was that it rendered the fact that my body was dying and that I was in extreme pain irrelevant. And what I mean by that particularly is that extreme pain or the death of the body couldn't impact the overwhelming peace that I felt. They were that the deepest reality of who or what I was of a substance that was so far beyond the limitations of that body that neither its pain nor its death could impact my peace. Um, the death of that body could not be rendered a loss. And even the death, we could call it, of that individuated sense of self could not be rendered as a loss. Because after all, if that separateness is retired in favor of what is all-encompassingly all that contains all, again, how could there really be any sense of loss at all? There could not. And as I sat there in late morning of this particular day, staring out windows across the farmland, doing nothing else, that is the state of awareness I found myself in. And that's how I spent the rest of the afternoon and into the night. And when my father would come into the room occasionally and check on me and see how I was doing, uh, there was nothing to do or nothing to say. There was no impulse in me in any way to say, hey, Dad, I'm dying. Because that was already clear that that was kind of an irrelevant trifle. Um, he would look upon me, I would look back, I would smile. I felt tremendously loving towards him. And he would be satisfied and go on about his chores. And then come back and check again a little while later. And that's all that happened. I went into that night um, reveling in that same state of mind, that same frame of reference. One of the things that's extremely difficult to do if you're in extreme pain is to fall asleep and have a good night's sleep. Given that
Say
the,
that again. Say that
well,
again. I didn't catch it.
oh, I simply said that it can be extremely difficult to have a good night's sleep if one is in extreme pain.
Okay, I got it.
And so that night, I realized that that was likely to be quite different. That I might actually sleep for the first, reasonably well for the first time in many days, and that because again that suffering was no longer there, and that was true. And I slept. I still woke up periodically during the night, and when I would wake up, I would check in with this experience. And is it still going? Is the mercury still dropping? Is that life force draining away? Am I still dying? Yes. Oh, yes. And as every sort of molecule of life force drained away, then so equally so was the merging of into that infinite vastness increasing by the same measure. But that was experienced as such a beatific peace, an all-encompassing peace. In a popular source, I believe it's referenced as the peace that passes all understanding.
I have another
And
question.
that's
Would,
what was deepening. Yes,
would you clarify? You were still experiencing pain, but not suffering. Is that correct?
correct. It is.
How did you make that transition so that your pain didn't keep you awake?
I, as an individual self, did not, because it was that sense of individuated self contained in a body that would have that kind of perspective. It's that there was a perspective shift, that there was still pain in that body, but because it was so clear that I was not that body, in fact, I wasn't even really an individuated separate self in the first place, that the pain and suffering in that body need not be owned. It need not be, um, I didn't need to tell a story about it. It did not, the best way to phrase it to me is that it did not impact my peace at all. And so while there was pain in that physical body, there was no suffering of it in my in this awareness. And so if if you are totally lacking in suffering, well, it's it's very peaceful. You could even say it's very relaxing. There's nothing to keep you up at night.
I was a hospice chaplain for 15 years,
Yeah.
and one of the problems that hospice clients face is pain and
Yes.
how they manage their pain. And
Right.
what you have presented so far is a wonderful perspective on dying, so that there's no fear that there's emerging into a larger consciousness, or be it larger wholeness or oneness with all that is. If only hospice clients could grasp that and could learn how to experience pain without suffering, that would be a wonderful contribution.
Well, I agree with you, Dick. And I am not a hospice chaplain and have never been, but I have been around other people that were dying. Since the time of this event, which was a long time ago, uh, I would say that I've had the great fortune of being with people on a number of occasions as they were dying. Some of them were my family members and friends, and some were family and friends of others that had asked me to come. And I can I can vouch for my own experience in that I have seen other people in their dying process come to similar states of awareness. Um, and in fact, I suspect it is often the actual dying that is um, the life experience that that often shows people these things that that they would not otherwise have been able to access if they weren't dying. It puts a one of the funny perspectives that this offered in this moment for me, but I've seen this translated into other people's experiences too now. Uh, was what you said in that it rendered the idea of death as being a horrible, terrible, awful end utterly irrelevant. Because, first of all, clearly it wasn't an end at all, because the death of that body made no difference whatsoever to the aware consciousness. None. In fact, if anything, it taught and showed that aware consciousness how how limited the body is, and that by dropping the body, one reaches, touches, experiences a great slice of their much greater reality, showing them that those bodily limitations were never really true in the first place. Um, I, I've, this was not the last time that I got to experience the difference between pain and suffering. There were other, I'd be happy to share this near death experience for me was a powerful signpost on what became a spiritual journey. And uh, what a lot of people find surprising is that this experience, although it's gotten the most press in terms of my own other experiences, at the time it was not the most pivotal. There were other experiences coming in the next decade for me that actually moved my needle and changed my life more than this one. But this is the experience that was so startling in its clarity that I had to turn my life in a different direction. And among those other experiences that were coming were additional times in which I got to see what it was like to be in huge physical pain and also not to suffer from it. I don't know if that's a teachable skill, but I do know that the the capacity for it is a basic part of our human wiring. It is a basic part of our humanity because it is a basic part of our being. It's grounded in the deepest truth of what and who we are in a way that is universal. And so I know that the capacity to encounter this kind of experience is universal. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to get it this time around, but it does mean that that capacity is eternally there, and no one gets to avoid the truth forever, which I think is a lovely thought. Anyways,
Good, thank you.
I'm
Please
not
continue.
sure if I I'm not sure if I blew past the question or not there.
You did, you answered it. Thank you. Please
All right.
continue.
Well, in the course of this particular story, um, I went through a night in which I actually slept. That seemed kind of, among the many miracles. I awoke the next morning, and again, checking in. Am I still dying? Yes. Uh, how it's speeding up now. I can feel the body slowing down. The dying process is beginning to speed up. But so then the merging with the infinite is equally speeding up as well. And I can, perceive that there will come a point where that ultimate threshold is crossed and there is no coming back, in which the body will be laid aside permanently. I haven't reached that point yet, but I can see it's coming closer and faster. At that time in the morning, I thought again, I don't know when exactly that moment will be, but again, it's probably 36 hours out. I don't know, 48 hours, a little while. Um, and in the during that following morning, I was actually surprised that in my mind arose this a choice point that was very clear, that I had an open opportunity to cross that threshold if I wished, and that there was no judgment in that in any way, nor was there any effort. Like that, literally dying would be the easiest thing, easier than falling off a log. It would be merely you could say, a movement of mind to say yes to it. That's all. There would be no act of merit or judgment or effort or anything of the sort. And I've I've long reflected on that moment, because if what one is experiencing is the overwhelming peace that passes all understanding, the total cessation of suffering, and essentially being infused with what it feels like to have no sense of lack or want or need, and no sense of fear of any kind, then the idea of crossing that threshold could seem like an uh, well, just an entirely reasonable idea. It was clear to me that there would be no sense of loss in crossing that threshold, even when I looked into my father's eyes, and I could rationally understand he might be sad, but I knew the difference between pain and suffering, and I knew the truth of that underlying individuated self, that um, that what I was experiencing appeared. I mean, if everything is all one thing, then I'm not separate from him or from you or from anyone else either. Like there was no individuation in that, and so it again, words become extremely difficult to wrap around that, but that while in that illusory framework, he might illusorily experience a sense of loss, I knew that the fundamental underlying truth was that there could not be any loss at all, and that he would come to recognize that at some point as well. And so, again, at the end of the day, there is no loss for real. And so, um, the 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 idea that I could look at that threshold and cross as fully and permanently into this experience as possible, um, was only countered by a surprising thought in me, which was, well, why wouldn't you go that way? How would that not make all the sense in the world? To go and, be in the peace that passes all understanding. And yet this additional thought arose that went something like, I think I'm not going to cross over. I think I'm going to stay here because I have some things to do. And the reason that that was surprising to me was that I had no idea what those things were. I have things to do here? What? What? I don't even, I guess I'd stay if I don't know what those are. I've been, as a 29-year-old young man, I'd been trying to figure out what I was doing here. But I didn't have any real great clarity on it. And in the end, it was simply like, well, I guess if I'm going to stay, I'm going to have to try to figure that out. And it was still a little surprising that that could arise at all. But there was this sense that I, I needed to hang around. I was going to hang around, and I knew that I could cross back into that overwhelming wholeness another time, and that that would be just fine, and that the time difference would make no difference at all. And so again, there was actually no sense of loss really at the idea of staying, even though it was still a little baffling since I didn't know what I was really supposed to be doing here anyway. But that that second afternoon, as this sort of internal thought process spun out, there came a point where, after having decided, I guess I'm going to stay, my father comes into the room, and for the first time in many days in his care now, his face changes. And he looks at me carefully and he squinches his face up and he stares right into my eyes and he says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we're going to load up the car and head back over to the hospital. We're way out in the country. It is a 2 hour drive to go to a hospital. And and I think, all right, I guess that's what we'll do. I guess I'll stay. I mean, I had sort of decided it earlier. This is how that played out. And so we loaded up and we went back to the hospital. It's the same hospital that conducted the surgery in the first place. He takes me to the ER, and upon arrival, it is immediately deemed medically that I am in fact dying. And I'm dying for the dumbest, I am dying for the stupidest reason in all of medical science. My body is shutting down and dying simply from dehydration. And that is because days earlier, they had uh, kicked me out of the hospital in a state in which I really couldn't eat or drink. And that's another conversation we need not have here, but sometimes that's healthcare in America. And I had lost 12 pounds over the previous week or 5 days or whatever it'd been. Six, I'd have to count them up. But the fact is, I had also consumed so little liquid that my body was dying from dehydration. What that really means is that the fix for the problem is extremely simple also. And so those doctors attached a saline solution IV to my arm and immediately dumped a liter or two of saline solution into my body, which immediately began to reverse this entire process. And so as soon as that was attached to my arm, I began to feel that merging with the infinite reverse. I began to feel you could say, my feet coming back on the ground here. I could feel the life force flowing back in, not draining away. And because of the fact that earlier that day, I had sort of resolved that I was going to stay here, that this is a development that was met with essentially kind of a happy uh, contentment. And so I set aside emerging with the infinite and the peace that passes all understanding. I do shake my head at this sometimes because I think to myself, I came back here to this madhouse? Like, you give up the peace that passes all understanding for this chaotic place? Really? Interesting. but but again, it had been sort of decided already. And so it was met with a happy awareness. And from that point forward, my recovery, my physical recovery and healing from the surgery sped up like many-fold. And within, it turns out that being extremely dehydrated makes healing a much slower, more difficult, and more painful process. And so with all that restored, the healing just sped up immediately. And I was at the farmhouse for a total of 3 weeks, but 3 weeks later, I was actually ready to go home to my own home, and I went back to work, and I went back to the office, and in a way, that's been an interesting transition for me because I could not reconcile what I knew that I knew, saw that I saw, and felt what I felt, experienced what I'd experienced. I found it so difficult to reconcile that with the fact that I wasn't my body, that in fact, I wasn't really even an individuated self, but was this, it begins, words so often fail, but that all-encompassing oneness is what is really true. And yet, if you're rushing to work a little late and you're in traffic and you're eating a breakfast burrito and you're thinking about the meeting that you're going to miss if you're late and that you're going to have to deal with your boss and a million other things, all of a sudden the oneness of that overwhelming allness seems like a distant dream. And even though that I knew in my heart of hearts which of them was really real, and it was that was what um well it that difficulty in reconciling that for me resulted, first, it resulted in me essentially burying this experience. I couldn't figure out how I could live regular life with it, and so I kind of buried it, and yet couldn't possibly forget it. I just decided I certainly wasn't going to talk about it ever. um, what it did do also was turn me into a spiritual seeker in a way. I could say that I had been in some ways in the past already, but it turned me into a spiritual seeker in a way that I don't know that any other experience could have. And that was an extremely internal, private experience for me. That was not something that involved groups or teachers or any community in any way. And no one ever would have seen me walking down the street and thought, oh, that guy, he's a spiritual seeker. Or there's a future spiritual teacher walking down the street. I did not carry a yoga mat. I didn't have a man bun. There was no kale involved. There were no crystals. There were no churches. There were no teachers. um, I didn't have a traditional church background to contend with. And so it really just became an intensely private, very personal, very internal journey that began over the next decade plus to reach a pitch that internally for me became absolutely ferocious and led to a long, a stream of other experiences. A um, I sometimes I don't even know where to start, but um, you know, in which there was, I think you probably hear these stories often, that my own intuitive capacities, which I didn't really have much awareness of, uh, began to come up more. There was, you know, eventually there were, episodes in which there were past life experiences and a couple of out of body experiences, and um, a shared death experience. I didn't know that was a word until quite recently, actually. But my father, who had taken care of me during this episode, has never heard these stories. A decade later, I was he was in a hospital bed dying, and I was the one tasked with uh, pulling the cord on the machines and letting him die. And that was, uh, of all the family members that I have around me, there could be no question that it's a funny thing to say out loud, but I was the most qualified for that task in a way that none of them would have been able to be, and I feel very grateful for that. Um,
Verify the task.
well, in the case of my father, I mean, I felt qualified for the task.
Your father was dying. Is that what happened?
He was dying. He was on supported by machines, and I was the one tasked with telling the doctors when to unplug the machines and let him die.
Okay.
Um, and one way of sort of encapsulating the whole story was to say that I think I was the only family member that had the opportunity to meet that in a way that was really completely peaceful. And I feel very grateful for that. It was as though in his case, I mean, the actual experience there was that um, when I joined him in his hospital room alone, I felt as though I joined with him on an inner level, a sort of, you could call it a spirit level or a soul level. I kind of like the word spirit better. But and I got to travel with him right out to the very edge of that infinite, vast allness. And I got to sit there with him. It was sort of like sitting on the edge of the Grand Canyon. And it was sort of like getting to walk him to the edge and show him, like, this is where you're going. Let me walk you there. And but to do so with him was an honor, and it was a bliss. It was like, let me show you the peace that passes all understanding and the greatest love that you could possibly imagine. What a gift it is to be able to share that with someone. And you cannot share the all-encompassing love with someone without experiencing some all-encompassing love. You can't go there with them without being in it. And so, the very last worldly act I had with my father, and trust me, we did not have a perfect relationship, but um, but it was still a perfect moment. And I got to sit on that edge of that vast eternity with him and just revel in it with him for hours. And all these other family members were coming from all over the country to come to his bedside, and um, I would I would be able to comfort them and give them a hug. And um, although there were a lot of people crying, and sometimes tears fell down my own face, but behind those tears was also a an awareness of everything I've shared with you today. And it's impossible to have that awareness without a very quiet joy. And it's not as though I was trying to express joy to my family members. I was trying to express compassion and love. Uh, but when the time came to gather around his bedside and I to give the final order to unhook the machines and let him die, for me, it was sad for my family members and a kind of quiet joy in blessing my father on his journey because I knew where he was going, and that was going to be the greatest gift I could possibly share with him. And in the well, one of the things that his passing um, e- evoked in me was a desire to finally fully reconcile the experiences I'd had. And um, if I had been, growing into a spiritual seeker that had become quite ferocious, it had become ferocious to a level that I really felt like I was starting to not function in regular life very well. And so, and it felt like it had been kind of falling apart for some time. And so soon after his passing, I felt so consumed by the inner impulse to have that reconciliation that I devoted myself to it completely. And it took a funny form, but it's the kind of thing that you read about in spiritual stories, and I felt as though I absolutely had to do it, and I totally blew up my life, actually. At the time, uh, well, at the so what that meant in this was that I sold my half of the little company that I was running back to my business partner. I sold my car. I gave the keys to my home to someone I barely knew. And I said goodbye to the lovely, lovely woman that had been my partner for a few years. And I disappeared into a solo retreat in which I spent months writing. And writing for me was what a good Zen Buddhist would call self inquiry. And I sort of wrote my way through all the experiences to try to understand them. But really, that that writing was a process of getting to the bottom of fear, and the the essential task was to that I set myself. And at the time, I didn't know if this was possible. I didn't know if this was insane. I mean, I already knew that what I was doing was pretty insane because I walked away from my entire adulthood. But the task was to get to the bottom of fear, and I would write and write and write and pick it apart, pick apart my own experience, pick apart everything in my own mind, and I said to myself, I will try to get to the bottom if there is a bottom. I don't know if there is, but I cannot not do this. And I could talk a lot about all the interim steps, um, but eventually there came a point in which there was a sincere and dramatic shift inside of me. It's the kind of thing that people often describe as awakening. And I I find all of our words generally to be a bit inadequate and often too poetic even. Like the best the best word I can think of is that it was simply an inner shift. But it was a shift in favor of that underlying oneness. And while over those particular years there had been this period of 4 or 5 years in which I reconnected with the inner experience that that individuated sense of self was actually an illusion. It wasn't true. And this was during the period, this is before my father died. I'm still running a little company. I'm living an ordinary life. And that sense that that individuated self wasn't true would sort of waver in and out. And when it was, when that pendulum swung one way, I was more in touch with that piece. And then it would swing the other way at other times, and I was panicked and like, what am I even doing? This is nuts. Uh, I have a mortgage. I need to be a regular adult. What do you mean there's no personal self in there? That's absurd. That personal self has bills to pay. But when I set myself on this retreat, that that all eventually collapsed. And that sense that one, that individuated sense of self was fundamentally not true, um, just kind of settled in a way that seemed permanent. And a sense of that peace that came with that settled in a way that seems permanent. And I don't think that either of those things would have been possible without that near death experience to kind of light the way for uh, that subsequent experience. I want to be very clear that it doesn't mean that here on this very human plane that I don't experience ups and downs as though somehow my experience here is perfectly peaceful all the time. It is not. Sometimes I get annoyed and sometimes I cry. But even in the moments of that annoyance and even in the moments of that being moved to tears, there's still some awareness that underlies it that reminds me that the tears are not the whole story, or that the difficult experience, whatever it is not the whole story. That underneath that, there remains a kind of all-encompassing oneness. And so if I had to describe ultimately what changed, it was simply that I began to meet the difficult things from a different framework and a different perspective. And it's that different perspective that ultimately became the core of how I began to work with people and to do healing work and occasionally teaching work, and sometimes things like this today. Oftentimes, um, in those kinds of moments with people, it's possible, I find, um, to to share a little bit of that experience essentially with someone, and it's as though some aspect of that kind of oneness rises up inside them and they experience it in some way that is meaningful to them or accessible to them or understandable to them. And sometimes that takes the form of some kind of healing, whether it's physical healing or psycho-spiritual healing. Quite often it presents itself simply as a kind of peacefulness that might be unusual for them. Um, and I would just add one last thing, that that people often ask, but what is it that you do? How do you do that? And it's a difficult question for me to answer. And the reason is because at the absolute core, there is still that awareness that that individuated sense of self simply isn't really true. And when it's time to have that kind of healing experience with someone, my only instructions from the universe, from spirit, are to quiet down and become in touch with that lack of an individuated sense of self. It's like disappearing into the hand of God. I mean, that's a poetic phrase, but it's hard to come up with a better one. And so when someone says, but what do you do? It becomes difficult. It's if I've said out of one side of my mouth, I'm not even there. And then I try to explain to someone how I'm actually checking the Akashic records. That's a contradiction. It is a contradiction. It becomes easier to say what I'm not doing. I'm not praying for this person. I'm not even hoping something good will come to them. I'm setting aside absolutely any sense of individuated personal volition in every way. I'm not checking records. I'm not talking to guides. I'm not doing Reiki. I'm not moving energy. I'm not connecting with angels. I'm not invoking spirit. I'm not talking to 12th dimensional anythings or 24th dimensional or fifth dimensional. It doesn't matter how many dimensions. And uh, yeah, it's why it's quiet. And and it's again as though some aspect of that underlying overarching wholeness that is entirely one and missing absolutely nothing can arise. Because if it is missing absolutely nothing and is in fact completely whole, then nothing there can be broken. There cannot be anything that actually needs healing in the first place. Which is among, again, the reasons why there's nothing for me to be doing. And so some kind of awareness of that oneness arises in them. And they may experience that as some kind of healing, or they may experience it as some kind of energetic movement. They may feel it as though they themselves are somehow connected to their own stream of spirit, which means maybe they're in more connection with their own guidance. It renders me ideally useless. That there's nothing that I might experience that they are not capable of experiencing themselves, and in fact, therefore, don't need me. And so when someone says, "Are you a healer?" I kind of I kind of choke a little bit every time. If I'm honest, I say, not exactly. No, not really. Are you a mystic? I guess so. Do you do Reiki? No. Can you polish my auras? I don't know. Um, it's a funny road. Um, it 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 becomes one that is so simple that it's hard to explain its simplicity. And when sometimes when people tell me grand tales of how complicated the universe is, uh, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. Um, there's no way that something that is fundamentally one can really be that complicated. The math is really quite simple. It's not even two. And sometimes it can also be extraordinarily difficult to express, which is why oftentimes my favorite moments with people that come to me are the silent ones. We often don't talk much. I often put my hand on their head. That was a prompt that came a long time ago. And it was strange to me how putting a hand on somebody's head could open up the opportunity for them to have a little touch of this experience themselves. It was also clear to me that putting a hand on their head wasn't strictly even necessary. My best understanding of why I would put my hand on somebody's head still has nothing to do with me being an activating force for them. I am not. Putting a hand on someone's head, actually, what it does is it gives their own mind permission, a greater permission to believe a thing is happening. And if they believe a thing is happening, then they're open to some kind of shift inside themselves. But whose mind then is it the one that changed? It was theirs, not me. I did not reach in them and pull a lever. They changed their own mind. My favorite analogy is the analogy of the lighthouse for that reason. A lighthouse might stand on a rocky hill, and when ships come into the harbor and that light is shining on the harbor, they may get to see new information. And based on that new information, they may change their course. But at no point ever does the lighthouse reach inside the ship and turn the wheel. It is the captain that turns the wheel, only, ever. If anything, it's not even the will of the lighthouse to help the captain. That's really the will of the lighthouse's maker that put the lighthouse there. The lighthouse just shines. The lighthouse isn't even invested in what happens to the ship. The ship could crash on the rocks, but the lighthouse is still going to shine. It doesn't really make any difference to the lighthouse. And it's among the reasons why when people have said to me, are you trying to save the world? The answer is a hearty no. I'm not. I might be given to shine, but that's it. It doesn't mean it's not a joy. It is. There's no way that healing could be invoked or experienced without there being some component of joy in it. And it's a lovely thing to be able to share. But I'm not in the business of taking away other people's choices. They can turn their wheel however they like. There's one last story that might seem relevant here. I've certainly done a lot of talking, probably more than usual. Um, a number of years after that near-death experience, I encountered another situation. The details are not all that important. That involved huge physical pain. And again, skipping all over all the details, they're not that relevant. But um, I fought against the pain until it completely broke me down. And the first thing that happened was as I fought through that pain, and like a dude, I'm gonna tough it out and handle it. It's not that I'd forgotten my previous experience. It was kind of distant. I had buried it, and that pain just broke me open, and I had an experience in which I sort of unfortunately experienced this odd thing in which the box inside me cracked open and I began to have what you might call a life review, but it was the worst kind possible. And in one moment, I was experiencing every instance of pain, physically or emotionally, that I'd ever had all at the same time, all at once. And it was utterly overwhelming. And I broke down, uh, sobbing. and and then it changed and it broke. If it could get it, you know, it's one of those things that's hard to put into words, but if it could possibly get any worse, it did. It broke something else inside and turned into feeling as though I was experiencing the collective pain of all of mankind, 8 billion souls simultaneously. And that was a level of overwhelm I have never encountered. I had never encountered before. I've encountered it many times since, but um, but at that time, it was overwhelming in a way I can scarcely articulate. The following day, I had a very rich experience in which I was returned very much to the experience in that NDE, in which it was clear, I understood more clearly than ever that I was not actually my body, and that all of that suffering, all of it, even 8 billion souls worth, was well, that there was more to the story. Um, and it was sort of like the divine had said to me, Jonathan, here's the problem. Here's your entire mess of personal pain, anything you've ever experienced. Overwhelming. Here, in fact, is the entire collective suffering of mankind. Surprisingly similar, just lots more of it. It was like saying, here's the problem. And the following day, there was this experience in which, again, clearly I'm not my body. I don't have to attach to that pain. There was this expansion of awareness, and the pain, the physical pain that I'd been experiencing, and all this emotional pain, and the pain of mankind could seem to be transcended or transcendable. And it was sort of like saying, here's the problem, well, here's the solution. And the next day, I'm wandering around shell shocked, like, my God, how do I connect the dots on these things? And the answer that arose in my mind was something I've always carried with me since. And it was the words, give up judgment. And as a part of that, it was shown that in the case of my own personal pain, physical pain or emotional pain of any kind, and even in the collective suffering of mankind, that all pain really was was presented. This is how it occurred at that time, was to me, was it is a misthought, a mistake in thinking. It's a misuse of mind. And in that way, it does have solution. It is transcendable. There's more to the story. And I spent the next many, many years trying to understand what that meant. Give up judgment. Because it presented literally as the solution to the suffering of mankind. And over time, I began to feel as though I grasped it more and more. I think it was much at the core of my own awakening experiences. One way I could describe it is that when we judge, especially when we judge, particularly, this is when we judge harshly, it is always an act of separation. And so it proceeds in the direction that is opposite to oneness. And that is the direction that pain is in. And yeah, it's a very simple 3 words. There could be a lot to unpack there. It could take a lifetime to unpack what that might mean in the course of a human life. But it was still very much at the core of my own awakening experience. And when I sit with someone that's come to me for whatever reason, um, it makes sense, because it's still in that moment that I sit with them and just simply go to a place of silence and stillness, in which even that movement of mind that could create a sense of self is not there. And so there is no sense of separation. Anyway, my goodness, it could be a lot to chew on. A lot of times when I work with people in some of these ways, it's quite charming. Sometimes they become silent too, and don't really want to talk. um, but sometimes people want to ask questions, and frankly, sometimes the intuitive information pops up on my end too, and we can talk about it, and it becomes part of their healing. But that's a long-winded way of saying I'd be happy to entertain any questions if anyone still wants to talk.
That's good. That's a perfect time for this. We want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to ask a question. Hello, Cheryl. Who would like to be first? You can raise your hand if you're on Zoom or here in the room.
Yep. I mean, for those who know how to do it, you're welcome to type me something in the chat.
Okay, Chuck has a question.
Sure.
Uh, I resonate so much with what you're saying. I'm a retired physician. I encountered out-of-body experiences as a physician, was with the Virginia Beach IONS group for a long time. I have probably 100 books on near-death experience here beside me. I'm teaching a group. One of our sayings, I am not a body, I am free, for I am still as God created me.
Oh, that's gonna make me tear up, man. Oh my God.
It's so I had the experience of Jesus speaking to me, or a voice speaking to me as a teenager saying, won't you come and work with me? So I've spent my whole life trying to investigate and understand what life is all about. And I truly believe that what you're saying is the reality. It's the reality that I love and I teach, and it's
Amen, brother.
beautiful. I don't know. I was a hospice physician. I was at a different hospice than Dick was, and only for 10 years. But we started with no patients, and by the time I retired, we had the census of about 130. And I was responsible for treating pain. This whole lesson of what healing is, being able to sit with somebody and not focus on the physical, but focus on them as spiritual, and ask the Lord to come into their spiritual being and provide healing. That's such a powerful and difficult thing to do. In the course of being a physician, I've uncoupled many people to let them die, and that's I know how difficult that is. But I've taken notes all the way through here, and most everything you've said resonates with what I've learned and where I'm at. Can you put your email someplace so I'd love to
Yes.
communicate.
Yes, of course. Well, here's what I'll do. I'll tell you what, I'll do this. Everyone, I believe, will be able to see this. First of all, um, I'm not hard to find these days. Um, let's see here. Make sure I spell in my own email correctly. Um,
Jonathan, the assist spirit.
hmm. So yeah, any of you are welcome to reach out. Um, tell me your own experience. Share any thoughts or reactions or things that today might evoke, or down in the next couple days or something. And
But,
yeah, there's
Mm.
of course there's there's a website and there's YouTube things and there's it's all on the website and via website. Well, here's the website.
are you familiar at all with the Course in Miracles?
Um, I am nominally familiar. Um, um, the kind of late in the game for me, like well after the near death experience, for instance, I did stumble across the course and found that what I had read of it helped me understand my own experiences better than most other sources. I have a huge respect for A Course in Miracles. I don't consider I don't I have no intention to consider myself some sort of course teacher or something. I just I don't it just doesn't seem like the way. Um, but um, but it's there's only a handful of spiritual documents that I've come across that resonate really deeply. I with me personally, I think there's an enormous array of spiritual documents that have their place in the world and have some usefulness to many, and amen for that. But there's relatively few that I really find well. I'll just say that I do think the course it occupies a rather singular place in the spiritual discourse that I have a huge respect for. Yeah.
But Cheryl has a question and it's on the screen. Can you see it?
Yes. Let's see. How are you maintaining your peace during these political times where people are being harmed by those in power? Yeah, that's a certainly a good question, and I'll tell you how I navigate that. Um, I know it's something a lot of people have been thinking about a lot, and there's sort of I find myself going down sort of three different lanes of thinking when confronted with um, the the, sometimes the hypocrisy and sometimes the outright cruelty that this world brings from many sources. And one of them is I look outside or I look around me wherever I am, and if I've done something so foolish as turn on the news or something, I don't do it actually, but sometimes it just shows up. Can't be avoided. But sometimes I look around me and I go, all right, it's crazy out there. But how am I right here, right now? How am I right here, right now? I'm walking down a street. There's spring flowers blooming. What is my immediate circumstance telling me? Is it telling me that I'm okay? All right, now I have a choice. Which one do I want to listen to? Like, do I want to pay more attention to the chaos that's out there, or do I want to be more grounded in what's actually happening to me in this moment right now? Sometimes that's a nice way. Sometimes that works. It doesn't always work. um, Another way that I look upon things sometimes is one I'm sure all of you are actually somewhat familiar with as well, in which I say, what is going on with that person? That's that person that is doing something crazy, annoying, upsetting, or something of the sort. They may be right in front of my face. They might be on a television screen. Most likely, they're on Facebook. Uh, and I do that thing where I look at them, and I sort of two ways about it. I look first and I say, what are they hurting from? Are they hurting from something? Um, is there any way I can understand what they're hurting from or what their hurt is about? Is there any way I can gain some insight or understanding into it? And it's almost impossible not to if you actually ask. Like, it's generally rather obvious. That's sort of the first step in this one. Like, can I perceive what or why they're hurting? And then I I go another step and I ask, if I look past that, if I look past their surface, if I look past their story, and if I look past a pain, can I connect to that undifferentiated wholeness that I know that we are? Can I see that in them also? This is going to make me tear up again. Can I see that in them in any way at all, even a little bit? And sometimes that helps. It helps me sometimes be compassionate for the person instead of annoyed at them, or at least it lowers my annoyance and gives me some understanding. And sometimes when I see that deep, deep truth in them that is beyond all of that, it just it just feels a little better, and it takes me down a notch into something a little kinder. And kindness, make no mistake, it's good for them, but it's exceptionally good for you. So that's another way, but there's a third. And sometimes that one works. That one I just mentioned, sometimes it works, sometimes it works just okay. Sometimes um, sometimes I kind of go all the way, and it's a way that I would rarely ever put into words. I would rarely describe this to people because it would sound frankly insane. But I feel like we got a good crowd here. I'm gonna say it anyway. And Chuck, I have little doubt that you'll appreciate it because when I really need to lean into it, I look at the situation and I remind myself as clearly as I can um, of that fundamental illusory nature of all of this madness. It, that that there's a level here on which it it is absolutely an illusion, and that yeah, I can see that in the illusion there may be all kinds of mayhem. But if one really does recognize it as an absolute illusion, it's still possible to see that there was no real effects. There's nothing really fundamentally happening. And it's I have to connect that to my own very direct and experience in which overwhelming blackout level pain could not disrupt my peace. Even the death of this body could not disrupt my peace. That I can see the illusory nature of the pain, the illusory nature of the body, and still be overwhelmingly peaceful and in touch with that underlying oneness, knowing again that the pain in that body had no real effect on that fundamental oneness. The death of that body had no effect on that fundamental oneness. And I'm still a human being on another level somehow. I look out and I see some of the trouble in the world, some of it very close to home, and it oh my God, it's going to make me tear up again. I see forests burning and climate change, and it just makes my heart ache. And all kinds of other human catastrophes that we pretty universally cause ourselves upon ourselves, collectively and individually, and it makes my heart ache. But but sometimes those are the kinds of moments that it's especially helpful to me to lean into that awareness that it is fundamentally an illusion that has no real effects on the underlying oneness. And that's a long walk. That's not something that I'm likely to share with the average person. Only because it would probably, well, most of the time it conflicts with their own sense of identity so much that it's actually troubling to them. And so it wouldn't be useful. It wouldn't be helpful to them. It would be the opposite.
Carol writes that you've answered her question. She says, thanks. I see Kathy's finger up. Kathy, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a comment. When you were describing the different labels that people would put on you, are you a psychic? Are you this? Are you that? Reminded me of the book by Eckhart Tolle, Silence Speaks.
Oh.
You don't need labels. And
Yeah.
the power in silence is tremendous.
I agree with you. Amen.
And thank
Kathy.
you for your speech today, because I've hung on every word.
Oh, it's a very funny thing to speak of how powerful silence is while flapping my gums for an hour and a half solid.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate the seeming contradiction, and yet still there is some underlying truth, I believe, to what you say.
Addie has a question. I'm going to put
Yes,
the
Eddie.
on Addie. Just a minute.
Hi, Eddie.
It's not really a question. It's just a sincere thank you. I was very close to not coming out this morning, staying relaxing, but I am so glad I did. You showed so much wisdom, and it seems that you really are here for a purpose, and I just feel very grateful that I got to hear you speak today. So thank you.
You're very welcome, Addie. And I'm glad you came. And I'm glad to be here too. And another one of those funny things about that kind of fundamental oneness is that it's impossible to share this with you without it being equally a gift to me. It really is.
Is there someone
And,
else in the room who has a comment or a question? Is there someone on Zoom who has a question or a comment? Well, then I have some comments and some questions.
fire away, good brother.
Right. I want to start from the beginning.
Oh.
Chuck already asked about A Course in Miracles, if you were familiar with that. And I had noticed that the concepts that you have about illusion especially come from A Course in Miracles. And that nothing really is real here. It's all an illusion. And that we don't have to worry about, for example, sinfulness, because there is no such thing. It doesn't exist. Anyway, those concepts, I believe you got from yourself, not from someone else. You remind me of the writings of Eckhart Tolle. And I don't believe you've been a student of him. You got this on your own. And that's part of the light, your light. You see, in your experience, you didn't hear from angels or Jesus or someone else to arrive at the conclusions that you have arrived at, the truths that you've arrived at. You looked within yourself. You went on that spiritual journey to explore by logic and thinking. How could this happen? How can I reconcile all of this? And that makes you a special light, because not everybody hears from an angel or Jesus, but everybody has the ability to think and try to reconcile it within themselves. And so that's a special gift that you have. And you ask, what is the agenda for me if I'm staying on this earth plane in this space-time dimension? And that's it. You are the light that anybody can receive. And I'm thinking now, we all have auras. And if you come into
Mhm.
that state of, I call it at one-ment,
Mhm.
and you
That's a nice
sit
word.
quietly with somebody else, your energy is affecting that person, and they're able to resonate with that if they choose. And so that
Mhm.
can result in their healing. That's basically what I wanted to say about your comments. I worked with a hospice doctor by the name of Nicole Padmore. I think she's the head of Heartland nationally now, and I'm going to communicate with her, and I'm going to tell her about what you have said, and I'm going to talk with her about pain management and this perspective. I want to do that because what you have shared is so important. Let me look further in my notes here. I remembered a verse from the Bible that reminds me very much of what you just said. I think it's in Isaiah 26:3. I'm not sure the exact reference. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee.
Oh.
Can substitute for thee that eternal perspective, that we're part of the eternal, the wholeness, the oneness. And so you don't, if people can grasp onto that, they can remain in perfect peace. I remember how you were saying you don't really aren't a healer, but you maybe are a catalyst for healing for someone else. And that reminded me of what Jesus said to the woman who touched the hem of his garment. People say, oh, it's energy that came from Jesus that made her well. But Jesus said, no, her faith has made you well. She believed that it could happen, and it did happen because she believed it. So it was her faith that made her well. Edgar Casey also said,
like
all
that.
healing comes from within. It doesn't come from outside of someone else, but what they have within themselves. So the lighthouse is there by the will of the maker, and you are here by the will of the maker. So
Wait, did Edgar Casey say that about lighthouses? Or you mean I said that? Or did Edgar Casey say that?
you said it about lighthouse.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do like the lighthouse. I like that. That's a good metaphor.
Yeah. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you, sir.
I thank you very much for being our speaker today. And this isn't the end, you know. The truths that you today will be manifest because I'm going to give everybody who has an email connection with me the link to this video so they can watch it at their leisure. And
Wow.
thank you
Good.
very much. Any other questions or comments?
I'll make one myself if I can.
Okay, please.
Oh, well, for one thing, I'm probably gonna I'm probably gonna swing by the East Coast again in the fall, and I'll be happy to come by and join you guys in your church there, uh, one of those Sundays if you're around and doing it. Um, that's all. I'm not sure when that's gonna be, but probably in late October or something like that. But anyway, I wish I could be there in the room with y'all right now. That just sounds nice.
Well, if you were here, you could come to the picnic for us
Sure,
after this meeting, because today is the 22nd anniversary of the founding of Virginia Beach Friends of Ions. Cheryl, who's on the Zoom call with us, started this 22 years ago on May the 3rd. So we're having a birthday cake with 22 candles on it and a picnic at the house right after this meeting, and everybody's invited.
Wonderful.
I
Amen.
wish you were here.
I rather do too.
Any last comments or questions? I don't hear any. All right, I'm going to look.
If they arise later, any of you are welcome to reach out and you know, find me on the old website and stuff like that. You're welcome to reach out and let me know what cooks.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan.
You're very welcome.
Here's your audience, and they're all applauding you.
Wow. Peace be with all of you, my friends. Peace be with all of you. Glad you came.
Talk to you later.
All right.
I